Hi there, Mrs. Verpka with 8th grade American History. In Chapter 3, we learned about how the New England, Middle, and Southern colonies were established. In Chapter 4, we are going to take a closer look at what life in those colonies was like. The first section of Chapter 14 is about the New England colonies. Objective 1. Explain how distinct regions developed during the colonial period. Between 1700 and 1750, England's colonies in North America doubled and then doubled again. Because of this, 3 distinct regions were formed. As you can see, each region is a little bit different from the next because of their location. Different groups of people settled these regions based on location and what the region had to offer. In the New England colonies, you can see that the winters were long and the soil was rocky. In the middle colonies, they had short winters and fertile soil, and in the southern colonies, a nice warm climate with good soil. That also made it so that different groups of people settled in the different regions. Objective 2. Describe life in the New England farms and towns. Most farmers in the New England area practiced subsistence farming, which meant that they produced only enough for themselves and their families with very little left over to sell to make a profit. Part of this was due to the growing season and the fact that it was a very short growing season and the soil in the New England colonies was very rocky. Something else that is a little bit different in the New England colonies is the way that land was sold. Large plots of land were sold to large groups rather than to individuals. Once the group bought the land, then the land was divided among its members. So a lot of times this had to do with church congregations. Something else that is unique about the setup of a town is that farmhouses actually surrounded a central square. People lived together in small towns, enabling shopkeepers to make a living. So if they needed to, they could hire somebody that was more specialized in a specific job and bring them into the town. Objective 3. Describe the 3 types of Atlantic trade. New England settlers engaged in 3 different types of trade, and those 3 types are trading within the colonies. So they would trade with their neighbors, direct exchange of goods with England. So they specifically imported and exported goods to and from England, and then also the triangular trade. The triangular trade, the name is given to a route that has 3 specific stops. So for example, maybe a ship would leave New England with some kind of cargo on it. It might take that cargo to Africa, and then when they got to Africa, they might trade that cargo for slaves. Once the slaves were loaded up onto the ship, then they might head to the West Indies, where they would trade the slaves for either sugar or molasses, something that they could then take back to England. And once they were back in England, that process would start all over again. Because the New England colonies were making such a profit from the triangular trade, England decided that they also wanted to share in some of that profit. So they passed the Navigation Acts, which put in place 4 major provisions. The 4 provisions that the Navigation Acts put into place all had to do with England making some kind of money. So therefore, any shipping that was being done that the New England colonies were doing had to be done in English ships. Certain products could only be sold to England or England's colonies. European imports to colonies had to pass through English ports, and if they didn't pass through English ports, another tax was put on top of them. So no matter what, England was making some kind of money off of any trade that was going on. A lot of times you would have merchants ignore any of those provisions, and if they did that, that was considered to be smuggling, importing or exporting goods illegally. Objective 4. Identify the reasons for changes in Puritan society. The Puritan religion was gradually on the decline in the New England colonies, and we're going to look right now at some of the reasons that that was taking place. Economic success competed with Puritan ideas. So people were starting to think for themselves. They didn't just want to follow what Puritan ideas were telling them to do. There was also an increase in competition from other religious groups. So, one example was that Baptist groups were starting to establish churches in some of the New England colonies, such as Massachusetts and Connecticut. So, it wasn't just the Puritan religion in those places anymore. Political changes also weakened Puritan society and the community. Certain charters granted religious freedom, so it's saying that more than just the Puritan religion is welcome in the area. Charters granted those owning property the right to vote, so it wasn't just the members of the church that were voting. And then Puritans were no longer controlling the elections in which people were voting. So all those things started changing the way that life and beliefs in the New England colonies were being seen. Now that you've gone through these notes, you also have an assignment, a book assignment, which is on page 113, number 2, which you also have to answer the question that is under the chart, as well as 3A, B, and C.